Hey folks, welcome back to Demystify Sci. I'm Shiloh,
I'm Anastasia.
and today on the show we are chasing down some interesting threads that have cropped up in the course of several conversations with philosophers and scientists who are starting to reach beyond science with their interests. So we had some podcasts with our friend Michael Hughes. We also met up with Keelan Morgan from Formscapes recently and started to poke our heads into this underground world of Western esotericism, which is a tradition that's almost pagan in nature that precedes a lot of the Western Christian ideals that we inherited, and that kind of grew up alongside the Enlightenment that defines how we approach science as a culture today. And one of the names that kept cropping up in those conversations, and something that a lot of different philosophers were pointing, someone that a lot of different philosophers were pointing back to, was this gentleman named Henry Corbin. And I was kind of wondering who the heck this guy was, and I found there was one author who had written almost all of the available works that analyzed Corbin's ideas, and that was Tom Cheetham, who's joining us today on the podcast. He's an author, a bit of a Renaissance man, a poet. He does workshops online. He's an interesting dude.
A biologist by training.
Right, that's true. Yeah, he was originally a entomologist, I believe, studying bugs. And he also got gripped by this idea that nature can be understood in more ways than one. And so, of course, the scientific tradition that we've inherited is a very zero-sum operation where one idea is the champion. We have Nobel Prizes for people who are at the top of the pyramid, and we sort of proceed even in the not Popper, who's the other guy?
Kuhn?
The Kuhn, yeah. We proceed in this Kuhnian dynamic of one idea gets replaced by the next, and it's still just this idea that there's a consensus on things, we can roll with it until something better comes along. But there's this different approach that we find ourselves more interested in, and we've recently had a little conversation about Feyerabend and his idea of scientific anarchism, which circles around the idea that maybe a better approach is to actually entertain lots of different perspectives at once. And by doing that, and not even subscribing to any particular perspective, you might be able to approach a more realistic version of reality, a better understanding of nature, so to speak. And so that's a cosmology that we're really, really interested in. And it's been given lots of names on this podcast so far, but we are looking at who many of these philosophers seem to have pointed to, and that is Henry Corbin. So that's where we're starting our conversation today, and it's a wide-ranging conversation, of course, as always on this show.
But it's just trying to get at this question of what lies beyond the rational frame that we really prefer to use when we talk about science, where the Enlightenment was a project of rejecting supernaturalism, of rejecting the influence of the church over the way that we saw the natural world. And the great hope was that it would allow us to get to this place where we could seek out truth, plant a flag into truth, and then move on from it for forever. But the project of science is so young in many ways that I don't think that we really understand what science is or what it's capable of. And so as we've been doing this show,
it's also so disturbing that there's multiple truths, right? Like, this is inherently destabilizing, and we're kind of living through this era of multiple truths, right? I mean, like, I stumbled on this analogy in this podcast today where I'm like, yeah, you can describe a piece of music in terms of wave equations, but you can also just experience it as a piece of music. And so, like, one of them is not more true than the other one. They're both true, and that's really disturbing when you start to be a scientist and tear nature apart, and you realize, oh no, there's actually different ways of looking at this situation.
yeah, and Corbin has this idea of what Cheetham calls the imaginal world, which is that there is this other realm of inspiration and ideas that are just as real as the physical world. And that's really uncomfortable because we have, since the Enlightenment, decided that only the physicality matters. And yet those barriers are breaking down more and more over the course of the last, I don't know, 50 or 60 years maybe, as people start to embrace psychedelics, as they start to embrace the exploration of the mind, of postmodernism. And so this is a conversation that deals with where the roots of that kind of thinking come from, the effects that they have on us as people that are attempting to explore nature, and the difficulty that we're confronted with, which is that culture seems to be most stably built on the back of a unified set of beliefs. And when you get to a point where you're like, no, anything goes, there is this massive level of interpretation where you can go all the way down or all the way up and just keep coming up with new ways of seeing it, you suddenly lose the cohesion. And as we fade into this next era of just atomized reality, how does that allow us to maintain any kind of center, any kind of cohesion, any kind of culture, any kind of communion with one another, where we are able to see the world in radically different ways and yet still come together over the things that are immediate and unassailable. Like Cheetham keeps coming back to the idea of like, you still have to cook dinner. And that is where all of the esotericism and the abstraction collapses, because there's still this ground from which you have to spring. And so we're really trying to get at the bottom of it. And, it's a conversation that leaves me with more questions than answers, but it helps me structure the way that I think about these things, and really it pushes me towards a better understanding of what the actual problem is that we're facing, which is very cool, because I think that once you can define the problem, then you have much more latitude to actually be able to strategize and think about it.
I freaking love this stuff. I hope you guys do too. I mean, I suffered terrible trauma at the hands of postmodernists when I was in my 20s. And so I had a really strong back reaction to that. I got really into objectivism and Ayn Rand and everything, just trying to get the hell away from these people who said anything goes. But it's interesting that you can't escape it at some sense, right? Once you see that there's two ways to see any phenomenon, at least two, probably an infinite set of ways of comprehending nature, you have to start reassembling your worldview in a different fashion. It's not a simple consensus picture of reality, and that's tricky and perhaps painful, but I love this kind of conversation.
And before we get to the conversation, I hope that you will consider coming over to patreon.com. If you have some spare cash that you can afford to give us, we would really, really, really appreciate it, because this is what we love to do more than anything else. We love being supported by our audience. And so come on over to patreon.com. In return, you get both episodes early. You get to join our weekly patron chat where we get together and talk about all the ideas that are in the podcast, around the podcast, should be on the podcast. And it's just a really, really cool space.
We could also pick up a t-shirt. They're down below in the links. Show off Demystify Sci podcast as you walk around your neighborhood. You could also just share the podcast with somebody you know will like it. You could give us a good review on one of the podcast stores. There's a lot of ways you can support us. In any case, we hope you will come along on the adventure with us one way or the other. So enjoy this conversation. We'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
As an undergraduate, I was Mr. Philosophy, which turned out maybe not the best choice for me, but I've had a philosophical interests going back a really long time, but that didn't work out as a graduate career for me for reasons we don't have to get into, and I eventually went into the sciences, and strangely, that's where I picked up this transition to Henry Corbin. And by the way, I always use the French pronunciation because the first time, rather than Henry Corbin, and now I can't read.
Forgive my Americanism. Yeah, I'll learn it by the end of the podcast.
See, the first, for me, it was Henry Corbin because I'm an American. But the first talk I ever gave in public was in Switzerland at an Eranos conference, and and you don't do the Americanisms in Europe because they think you're an American and something of a Philistine. So I quickly learned that I have to, even though that I have to say Henri Corbin, and now I've trained myself, and it's my French isn't any good, but I can't say Henri Corbin anyway. So the transition that I made from being a wannabe scientist into Henri Corbin's world was really bizarre, even in retrospect. So I was just 38 years old, and I was beginning to have midlife psychological issues, which Jung will tell you can go ahead and expect when you're around 40. And of course, it doesn't happen to everybody, but it surely happened to me. And while I was in Santa Fe, New Mexico for my scientific career, I just happened upon a book in the bookstore in the lovely little square in Santa Fe, A Blue Fire, which was Tom Moore's compilation of James Hillman's works. And the title was cool. I thought, wow, Blue Fire, that's cool. Nice name for a book. So I picked it up. And within a few weeks, I started to read it. And as soon as I read it, it just really flipped me out. I thought, at the time, actually, I thought, this is what I've been looking for all my life. And this was the placement of imagination, suitably undefined, at the center of everything. That was Hillman. That's how I was reading Hillman. That's true. That's Hillman. And he partly got it from Jung. And so I read, we could talk about that, but because it gave me the whole baby, which I had split between science and philosophy, somehow. And no, you could have them both because they're both imagination. They're both imaginative activities. There's plenty more in there at the same time. But anyway, so I just totally flipped out on Hillman. And for a year or two, I was trying to decide whether I should go into complex systems theory and neuroscience in some weird form, or just follow this Hillman stuff. And I took the latter course. And I read Hillman for probably at least a couple of years, almost exclusively, just loving this new vision of reality that he was presenting. Not that I was able to fully adopt it. That took decades. But gosh, it was so exciting. And after a couple of years of reading him, I ran across his essay. I think it was an Eranos talk in the early 80s called The Thought of the Heart, which is still one of my favorite pieces by Hillman. And right at the beginning of that, he essentially says, well, if you're interested in the imagination, this guy, Henri Corbin, he's your man. Because Hillman had given this talk at the Eranos conferences, and Corbin had just died in 78. And he was a fixture at the Eranos conferences from 49, I think.
What are the Eranos conferences?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
Until he died in 78. So, but that's totally pertinent because the Eranos conferences, everybody thinks of them rightly as the place where C.G. Jung had his annual gathering, and that's true. But it was set up by a woman named, Helga Froiba-Kaptein in the 1920s, I want to say. I have to check the history, but at least by the 30s, it was up and running. And when she had money, and this extraordinary piece of property on Lago Maggiore outside of Ascona, Switzerland, which is still there, and they're still up and running, though for a while there were political problems. But anyway, it's still there.
I guess it started in 33 from
okay.
Wikipedia. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. And she knew when she set it up, or at least came to know C.G. Jung, who's Swiss. And she wanted to make it a place where people with similar people of academic, scholarly standing who were super interested in the issues of the mythological and the spiritual and the religious and or scientific, but whose they became the Eranos conferences became a center of, I suppose you could say, mythologically inflected studies. So people like Joseph Campbell were there, and D.T. Suzuki, and Mircea Eliade, and the list goes on and on and on and on. So if you were pretty much anybody in the upper ranks academically, or in Jung's case, professionally, you were likely to be invited at one time or another. And it ran long past the time that Jung died, and into the early 80s, under the same, I think, more or less, under the same organizational structure. And it became quite important, certainly for the attendees, but also for the people who were invited to listen. Here's an example that'll put them into some sort of context. It's not the only context, but the Paul Mellon and his wife, who of the Mellons of American money, they funded publications of the Eranos conferences. And the first ones were the series that Joseph Campbell started doing in the 50s and 60s, lectures from the Eranos conference, Man and Time. There's a number of them. And what's important for our little story here is that in 1950, I'm losing my dates, but in the late 50s, one of Henry Corbin's Eranos lectures was translated and published for the first time in English it was Man and Time, and it was in the Bollingen series, published by Princeton University and sponsored by the Mellon family. And that series, I came to find out just a few decades ago, was routinely read by lots of the poets in the United States. Diane de Prima, one of the beat poets, said, "Oh yeah, we were all reading everything that came out in the Bollingen series because it all had to do with mythology." So many of those people, Charles Olson, the American poet, and Diane de Prima, and Robert Duncan, and on and on and on and on, those people were reading these publications that came out of the Eranos conferences, and that's how the connection is made between Henri Corbin's work and the American poets, and I didn't know this until decades after I started my work on Corbin, but he had a remarkable influence or effect in certain aspects of the poetry world, particularly the radical poets, the beat poets in the United States, because of this connection with Eranos and the Jungians. Because a lot of those folks, they knew Jung because he was all about myth and archetypes, and so it's a natural fit for a certain kind of poetry.
What was why were the industrialists, Mellon and Princeton, why were they interested in this stuff?
Yeah, you're pushing at my knowledge here. Presumably because they went crazy in midlife too.
It could be. Yeah, maybe they just harbored curiosity.
Yeah. Well, because because Freud and Jung traveled in the circles of people with money. They weren't offering their psychoanalytical services to the man on the street. So there's in the
Well,
history here,
psychoanalysis was really popular with the
yeah,
wealthy.
yeah.
Right,
So yeah, and among poets and artists too, right? There's that's not my shtick, so I can only point at that direction. But sure,
that makes
that's
sense.
a lot of that was going on, and so in spite of the fact that the many or nearly all of the lectures at the Eranos conferences are really scholarly, they're also often at the leading edge of that kind of thinking at the time. And in fact, that's was one of the guiding principles was we're going to get together a bunch of really smart people to tell us what they're exploring now. David Miller, who is a emeritus professor of religious studies and religion at Syracuse, I think, was invited to the Eranos conferences during those late years when Hillman was also speaking there. And somewhere he tells a story about going there for the first time and listening to some scholar give a talk about these things, and he asked the woman sitting next to him, will there be questions at the end? And he's in my memory of the anecdote that he tells, and this is written somewhere, she looked at him scornfully, as only a European could to an American, and said, "Oh, you must be an American, and you don't yet understand that questions are not permitted because these people are telling you things they're not in a position to answer questions about because it's at the edge of what they are knowing." That sticks with me because that was clearly true, I think, in Corbin's writings. If you begin to know his work reasonably well, the writing is not finished and polished and systematically coherent. It's mythologically inflected thinking. That's true of Corbin, and it was true of a lot of the people who spoke there.
Well, it's kind of the essence of poetry in some sense too, right? That you have all of these flavors and imagery, and it's funny because you ask a poet like, "Hey, what's that poem about?" And it's always like the perennial impossible question to answer for a poet, right? They're like, "I don't know. I mean, what did you like?" It is what it is. And
yes,
so I can see that approach being continuous.
And so let me, so that's totally pertinent. But let me, for my own narrative purposes, drag you back into my my disembodied 1993 self. I loved abstraction. That was the philosophical stuff. I did biology for a number of years in a very embodied and particular way. I fell in love with biology because of the diversity of insects, among other things, but primarily. And yet I ended up, after a few years, wanting to do complex systems theory because I love that kind of theoretical. So that was really strong in my mind when I hit Hillman, which is not theoretical, and it's much more of this poetic. In fact, one of the things that struck me about Hillman was one of his primary metaphors is the poetic basis of mind. And even at the time, I just thought, gosh, that's as a foundational intuition about what makes us human, to say it's the poetic basis of mind. That even though I was being abstract and theoretical for, much of my life, I thought, boy, there's something really there. And then he points me to Henri Corbin. And this was in the early 90s, so there's no internet available. But the book that I knew that he had mentioned was Corbin's book, Creative Imagination and the Sufism of Ibn Arabi. So I'm an American. I went to a liberal university. I wasn't raised in any kind of religious tradition, just the opposite, in fact. And I fell in love with Hillman. And I got all this rationalism in me. And he says, if you really want to understand the imagination, you got to read Henry Corbin, this founding figure at Eranos. And I bought his book, Creative Imagination and the Sufism of Ibn Arabi. And within a couple pages, you're in Islamic metaphysics and angels and the Bible and the Quran. And I'm just, what? what is this stuff? So it was not love at first sight. It was antipathy and attraction in equal parts, because my hero said, this is the real deal. And I mean, I'll compress the actual history there. Because I didn't realize this quite immediately, though I guess I probably caught on to it. On the first page, he refers to contemporary phenomenology. The book was written in the 50s, 60s, in the 50s, late 50s, and there's the phenomenology, and I really? Phenomenology. That's Husserl, that's Heidegger. Oh, okay. And you turn a page and you got angels, Oh man, what? And so I was really wondering who this dude was. And here comes the story about Corbin, because all these years later, he was something else. I mean, he in the circle of people who were invited to Eranos, he wasn't a crazy outlier, because everybody there was an astonishing scholar of something. I mean, really, they really were. But Corbin was unique. And then the really good story is that he had a background he went to the Sorbonne and studied under Louis Massignon and Émile Brehier and Etienne Gilson, and he was interested from his early days. He was a mystic of sorts, but a very, very scholarly one. So going to the Sorbonne in the 20s and 30s, as he did, you would have learned, if you were interested in religion and mysticism and philosophy, you would have learned a handful of languages, like more than a handful. And when he was taking a course from Louis Massignon immediately thought, this kid, he's okay. And he said to him, I got a book for you. And Massignon, he's a story on his own. He brought to Corbin the mimeographed sheets of a manuscript from the library in Istanbul, as far as I'm aware, which is in medieval Persian by a guy named Shuravardi. And he said, here's a book for you. And so Corbin was like, oh, shit. I was just trying to learn Sanskrit because of Brehier, and now I've got to learn medieval Persian. Okay. And so he, for whatever reason, he decides that he starts reading Shuravardi, who just became, as he says, my inner guide all my life. So he developed a spiritual, intellectual, and arguably mystical relationship with this medieval Persian Islamic mystic. And he translated this manuscript from Persian, and probably there was Arabic in there too. Honestly, I don't know. So he learned Arabic and Persian, and along with all the other languages that he knew. And Shuravardi just really got to him. And this is roughly the same time that Martin Heidegger published Being and Time. which, if you know anything about Western philosophy, was a big deal, even at the time, and has only become more so in the ensuing many decades. But Being in Time, I think, was published in 29, maybe. And Corbin, being Corbin, was super interested in anything that came out of Germany because he had a real attraction for German mysticism of the Middle Ages and contemporary German theology, Karl Barth, and both Catholic and Protestant. So you begin to get this weird picture that Corbin is kind of a interesting dude. He's very smart. He's multilingual. And he's interested in mysticism, and he's reading he's reading Martin Heidegger at the same time he's translating Shuravarti from the medieval Persian. And I know this for a fact. It's a story I had heard long ago, but I know it for a fact now because I have a friend who's seen the manuscript. Corbin's copy of Heidegger's German, the original German of Being in Time, is glossed and annotated in Persian and Arabic. So almost certainly, he's the only person in the world who is reading Heidegger through the lens of a medieval Persian Islamic mystic and seeing, oh, this is really cool. These guys are kind of onto the same thing, which is almost, it's right.
And what is the thing that they're both?
What is the thing?
Yeah.
What is the thing? Insofar as I am capable of understanding what the thing is, it was, and this hermeneutics is what it is. People have been, not you guys, but over the years, people tried to over and over again. Tom, don't talk about hermeneutics because it throws people off. But no, we have to talk about hermeneutics. But it's got a really simple meaning, which is just interpretation. But the reason it's important and the reason I perennially stick to the technical term is because the hermeneutic tradition in Western thought is anchored in the interpretation of the Bible. Okay? And at the same time, the word comes from the Greek. And Hermes was the messenger of the gods. So the hermeneutic, the hermetic, and if you stick with this material long enough, you begin to see the connections that Corbin has with the hermetic tradition, the occult, the esoteric. That is there in Corbin's world. Okay, so the word hermeneutic allows you to connect to Hermes Trismegistus of the magicians, and the ancient Egyptian lineages. Corbin is well aware, more than well aware of all of that, because it had those have Islamic connections too. The whole Hermetic tradition is not exclusively Western. It runs throughout those cultures, and here's the take-home message. It's crucially important for Heidegger and for the poets that we started with for the following reason. Heidegger's in his book Being in Time, he's trying to find a reasonably coherent way of talking about what it means to be human being. And he says, science isn't going to get me where I want to go because it's going to be chemistry and physics. And that's not going to cut it. And religion, you know what happens to those people. They just get all theological. And although I have sympathies with that because Heidegger knew Western theology super well. He wrote his master's thesis, the equivalent in Germany, on Duns Scotus, the late medieval theologian. So he knows that tradition. But what he comes up with is, gosh, this long tradition of the interpretation of a text, maybe something like hermeneutics would be the way to think about, to provide a kind of framework with suitable alterations for thinking about what it means to be human. Because, well, you get dropped into the world and you're immediately babbled at by people who are pointing things out to you and handing you little toys and tools. He says, you're immediately immersed in a world of meanings. And that's what hermeneutics is all about. It's about understanding the complexities, which are gobsmacking, the complexity of meanings. I think he says, rather than go into physics or theology or pick your favorite, we should do, he didn't say literary criticism, but he said the analysis of meanings. And then over the ensuing decades, his work and the hermeneutic tradition got developed more and more and more by philosophers and of course, literary critics. And so that entire that entire family of really complicated approaches to understanding our experience of the world just got developed more and more and more. So here's Henri Corbin reading Heidegger at the same time he's reading Shuravardi. And if you're an Islamic mystic or if you're a Jewish mystic, just for historical reasons, he ended up with Islam rather than Judaism. You could read the works of Elliot Wolfson if you want to know how this whole story works out in the Jewish tradition. Elliot Wolfson is probably the premier scholar, or certainly one of two or three premier scholars of Jewish mysticism and its history, and the importance of Henri Corbin for understanding those structures too. I know virtually nothing about that side of things, but notice, if you don't know anything about Islam, and you know almost nothing about Judaism, you will know that in the rabbinic tradition is full of commentaries on the original scripture, commentaries on commentaries, and commentaries on those commentaries. That's hermeneutics. Alfred North Whitehead said famously that the history of Western philosophy was a series of footnotes to Plato. That's hermeneutics. Commentaries on commentaries on commentaries. So anyway, Corbin is immersed in Shuravardi, who, of course, is immersed in the Quran and trying to figure out, as is the case for theologians in these, what Corbin and others have called the religions of the book, which would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. If you got the word of God, if you're, pardon me, very narrow-minded, you say, well, that's the truth. It's the word of God. But if you use any part of your thinking brain, you realize, if God's infinite, and mostly we don't know what the hell this is all about.
Well, it's something somebody wrote down, right? At the end of the day, it's like or people have cultivated over the years. It's right. So it just strikes me as there's this deep, deep ancient tradition of people having visions about something that they can't quite put into words, and then they attempt to do it, and then there's this interpretive level that just fades into, let's say, just explodes into infinity, where people are trying to make sense of like this still happens today, right? In these psychedelic ceremonies that people do, right, where they have shamans guiding. I mean, this is an ancient tradition of people trying to subject themselves to visions that don't make sense, and then spending the rest of their lives or whatever trying to pull the pieces out of that experience that's incomprehensible while you're having it, and then move forward. And I feel like poets are doing the exact same thing, right? You're struck by the muse, by the inspiration. You don't really know what's possessing you, and you scribble something down to the best of your ability, And that's why I feel like it's so difficult, like I said earlier, for a poet to say, well, this is a poem I wrote about blank. It's like, well, my God, it's about everything all at once. It's a cosmological perspective.
That is absolutely spot on, as they say. And that's Henri Corbin's point. Okay. There's an anecdote that I wish I could quote, but Syed Hossein Nasr, who's a traditionalist Islamic scholar and believer, who knew Corbin because, among other things, Corbin taught at the University of Tehran from 1940 something to he died. And so he knew the Iranian and the Persian traditions really well, and Nasr knew him. And for me, the totality of what you just said, to understand that, it took me a couple of decades to get at the point where I now see all of that pretty clearly. And it was Corbin and a few others, but Corbin will work to get me there, because if you're trained in the sciences, and trained in a lot of other things too, maybe, but trained in the sciences, you're looking for precision of meaning, and we can talk about that later on.
A particular kind of meaning too in the sciences, right? A very material focused reductionist kind of meaning, where it's like these like you're looking for mechanism, generally speaking. Whereas poetry is kind of the art, and poetry is the opposite. It's more just this explosion of possibilities. It's in some sense incoherent intentionally.
Yeah, yes, and no, of course. And so what Nasr says, is the Quran, which you have to read in Arabic, otherwise it isn't the Quran. Unlike the Christian Bible, if you read the Quran in any other language, it isn't the Quran. And anybody who knows the Arabic, which I do not, will tell you that it's really super hard to translate, because
I mean, we had a cool conversation with a biblical scholar who was reading the Bible in Aramaic and finding all of these bizarre misattributions in the English translation, just simple things that people take for granted in contemporary Christian theology that are arguably not what it says, and really important ones, particularly with respect to, women versus men, and like what it means to be married, and like all these things that just have gotten kind of lost. And a lot of the mainstream powerful Christian authorities have kind of exploited to their own ends that have nothing to do with the original text. So I think that's true with any tradition, be it Islam or Christianity.
Yeah. No, that's I can't remember the guy's name, but I know who you're talking about. Yeah. And so Corbin's,
it was actually a lady. It was Jennifer Bird.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I don't know her. I would love to. Okay, that's great.
Yeah, she's cool. Check her out.
I totally will. So Corbin is kind of, he's hardly the first person to notice what you're talking about. But in a way, you could think of what you've been saying about the infinitude of the meanings in, for lack of a better term, poetic speech, is crucial to understanding. I can do this quickly. So Corbin, of course, he lived through 2 world wars. He knows what extremism is like, and he knows the long history of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, which has not been pretty. And he's trying to tell people, look, so all 3 of these great religions share the same intuitions, but then what happens is they become fundamentalized, all right? But at the core of each of these traditions is this unknown and unknowable, I hesitate to even say God, but that's what usually
Like a
gets.
kernel of purpose or something, some cosmological root.
Let's put it. Let's say it's a kernel of experience in line with what you were when you brought in the psychedelics. Um, at and so let me see if I can put this together, because this is where you end up after 30 years with Corbin. He's saying, look, if you want to know what unites the religions of the book, don't look at the institutionalized versions of the religions, because, history and people, and, you want to have a church. It's like, if you want to have a church, it's like if you're a quantum physicist and you nonetheless have to build a bridge. Well, you take some things as literal, and then you can walk across the bridge. And then the same thing with religions. You want to set up a little community. Well, what do you believe? Well, here's what we believe. Boom. And that goes bad really fast. And then Corbin says, well, this church is going to be different from this church. And, the Pope was not wrong about Luther. He said, oh, shit, it's just going to, there's going to be millions of these damn Protestant faiths. And of course there were. Same problem. So what Corbin is saying is, don't look at the institutions of these religions. These religions are built around these extraordinary experiences, which are in principle and in practice available to each of us. So
and they're very cosmic experiences, right? It's the experience of awakening into the universe in some way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so Corbin picks his favorite people from the heretical edges of the religions. And then so he'll take Ibn Arabi or Shurvardi, or, pick your favorite one of Corbin's, and they'll juxtapose him to somebody like Emanuel Swedenborg, who's hardly a mainstream Christian. Or Burma, and he's got a long list of favorite mystics and he says, you see, these people are talking about similar experiences, and he has very little sympathy for institutional religion, which gets him in hot water with people for good reason, So the technical term for what he's focusing on there is apophatic theology versus cataphatic theology. So the cataphatic, those are the things about God that you can talk about. But apophatic is beyond the experienceable. And he wrote a piece late in life called Apophatic Theology as the Antidote to Nihilism. And nihilism in the sense of fundamentalism, if all you have is the rules are important. Corbin, in spite of himself, will say, yeah, rules are important. Yep. Got to be able to build bridges. But the real experience is that stuff that you then spend the rest of your life trying to explain. And Jung, to bring us back to Eranos, Jung and Corbin saw eye to eye because they both were Gnostics and were not terribly afraid of admitting it. And the Gnostic experience is, with a capital G, and here's where it all, here's the tricky part. You have one of those experiences and you think, oh my God, I've seen the truth. And if you then try to make a religion out of it, things go downhill really fast. But if you've got the whatever it takes to say, oh, but it's just the edges of the truth, and rather than setting up a series of steps to get people to see what I saw, then you do what Corbin did, which was to say, oh no, you got to do it on your own. It's your God. And so Corbin has this peculiar theology of angels, so that he draws on the Zoroastrians for this, or at least explicitly draws it. But you find it in Islam and Judaism and Christianity, that in the Zoroastrian myth that Corbin likes to tell and that I love to tell, every being of light has an angel. And let me finish this little bit because it's so cool and everybody needs to hear it. So every being of light, and we'll ignore demons for right now, has an angel. And the goal of your life is to identify, orient yourself somehow using whatever means are available to you, orient yourself towards that angel who is nonetheless sort of always receding. Because if you caught her, and for Corbin it's almost always a her, so we get gender things at play here immediately, which is fabulously wonderful. Like Jung, Corbin thought that this androgynous religion business was so totally screwed up that we just had to do something about it. Nonetheless, if you ever caught your angel, then you'd be done. Bang, I got her. And that's deadly, as everybody knows in the human sense. If you ever catch her, you're going to imprison her. And I can only speak as a guy, but I see it very strongly from the male side. The female side, that's a whole different but analogous kind of theology that people have been working on for decades now. But the super cool thing about Corbin's version of the Zoroastrian myth is that even the supreme being has an angel out ahead. For the same reason. Otherwise, he'd be up there thinking, wow, I'm pretty supreme. I must be the most oops. And then you get like the end of Hegel's phenomenology of mind. Wham, it all closes in on itself and you're done. You got the truth. May as well just, I don't know, go out for coffee or something. There's nothing else to do. Yeah. So Corbin calls for, and he's mocking the Marxists. He says, I'm calling not for a perpetual revolution. I'm calling for a perpetual hermeneutic. And that's Corbin in a nutshell. So I'll just follow by saying this is why the poets looked at this guy and said, oh, this is cool. We're into this.
This psychedelic pinpoint is, maybe it's the easiest one for me to understand. And it's also such a hot situation, especially where we live. They're trying on all of these psychedelic therapies, which seem to be really useful for veterans, people with PTSD. But a hallmark of that experience is that there's a guide. There's some therapist that's helping people interpret their experience in a meaningful context that aids in their healing process, right? And of course, it's all based around medicine and healing because that's the new religion, for lack of a better word, right? Science and medicine, it's kind of our savior in the modern age from a rationalist perspective. But this tradition of interpretation with cosmic experiences seems to just, it won't go away. There's something about it.
Yeah, it won't go away. And what interests me, among other things, one of the things that really interests me is that interplay between interpretation and mystery. Because if you have too much of either side, things are likely to go off wrong. And I continued to have a fascination with James Hillman's work. And one of the the hallmarks of Hillman's approach to Jungian psychology, and there's lots to say here, is that he saw that, at least in his opinion, and it's my opinion too, some Jungians, because they're human beings, tend to get a little fundamentalist about Jungian analysis. And Hillman, and this is both a good thing and arguably sometimes a bad thing, he was so allergic to any of those fundamentalisms, So if he finds a Jungian category, or any category for that matter, he's more interested in blowing it up and following its diversification than he is in grabbing it as a tool. And so, and this is super pertinent, in what I understand to be, and perhaps wrongly, what I understand to be the most important part of Hillman's version of Jungian active imagination or dream work is, Hillman will say, if you get a snake in your dream, don't go look it up in the book to see what snakes have meant in the sort of Joseph Campbell sense. No implied, well, kind of an implied critique of people who read Campbell as if he were a library of meanings that you then must pick one of. Hillman, rather than as a display of the varieties of imaginative creations of the human spirit, Hillman would then say, if you get a snake in your dream, it's a snake. Look at it and tell me about it. Tell me what color it is and what its eyes are like and what it's doing. And Jung is good at this. It's some of his followers who are not. Jung would say, stay with the snake, stick to the image, because if you, and this is Jung and picked up by Hillman, that snake is trying to show you something or take you somewhere. You must treat it as if it were real. I'm super interested in this now for new reasons. That as if, that pretend, that play, that also goes both ways. I don't want to do the political thing quite yet, because the good part is you're sitting there in your wherever on your psychedelic trip with your guide, and it's not that you don't need the guide, particularly if you're there for the therapeutic reasons, and you're doing this because you're damaged rather than curious. That's whoops. You need a guide. Corbin says you lose your angel and you're in a lot of trouble because you might get a demon instead. So it's not that guides are bad. It's just you don't want to worship them.
And once they get that's the one thing that worries me about the medical psychedelics is I could see it becoming an institutionalized rule book for the guides to follow, where, much like you said, the snake means this or something, like things get concretized in a way that doesn't actually open people up to understanding how they feel about the snake and this experience and what that could actually say about this, that, or the other thing, or following it. It just, once you put it down in a book, you get into problems, I feel like.
Well, so many people want to be able to read the book, right? There's a certain fraction of people that will follow this idea that it is an individual journey, and that it is up to the internal interpretation to look at the snake and see it for what it is, as if it is real. And then there's another fraction that really want to be able to have the shortcut of, look, there's a table of interpretations. I will go to the table, and that is what allows me to move forward, because that serves as a foundation for whatever next level of the pyramid I want to build.
Yeah, and that's, frankly, most of us, most of the time, me included, because to be Um, the gosh, it used to be so much easier before we learned how horrible the Western tradition has been. Um, so when I talk about explorers, I have to be a little careful, but in the sense that there's something wonderful about exploration, but there's always something horrible about it.
I mean,
It's
conquering and exploration should be
yeah,
separate
yes, there you
concepts.
go. There you go. But and that's exactly it. That's exactly it. It's there's something unless you got your guys with you to do the conquering, the exploration gets overwhelmed with terror
Mm.
at every level. So you're on your trip and it goes off wrong, man. You want the book. You really want the book. You want the person to tell you what to do.
Because to wander into the unknown is absolutely terrifying. I think that we live in a world where the unknown is so limited and confined that most people never really encounter it. And I just finished this book about a group of river guides on the Grand Canyon on the Colorado who were trying to set a speed record. And so there's all this stuff about them trying to set the speed record, but the book begins with this historical perspective on the Colorado and talks about the first expedition to actually raft the river. And it's these dudes who are just going into this absolute unknown, total danger. They're completely destroyed by the river. They think they're going to die. They have their journals and they're writing in their journals as they get to this point where the crew is mutinying against the captain. The captain is basically not sure if any of them are going to survive. And it's this real visceral feeling of we have doomed ourselves to a terrible fate because the spirit of exploration has led us to this place where there is no book written, there's no map made, it has been terrible to this point, and the likelihood is that it's going to get worse and it will be our end. And they end up making it, but there is half the crew that decides to leave. And they leave after the worst of the rapids, and so they decide they're going to hike out and try to just walk out, and they end up getting killed. So like they run into a tribe, or they run into the story is unclear because there's no records, but they die, and the rest of the crew stays on, and it turns out that they're at the end of the canyon, and so like 20 miles downstream they're out and they're saved.
Yeah.
And it's like, but you don't know. It could have gone completely differently. It could have been completely the reverse. And that's the terror of exploration.
In so many settings, I think when I say we, I mean me. I try to break myself, and which is and that in itself is pretty characteristic of the Western male mind. People like me, when was I ever doing anything that would be terrifying like that? Well, I mean, no, we don't have that. And this is sort of a subsidiary conversation, but you might wonder why so many of us are so screwed up is because we've got it depends on who you're talking about. If more if more of my day were involved with staying alive or something existentially stressful, I really think I'd be a much stronger person psychologically.
Well, we have to create it you have to like go seek it and create it. I remember like my psychological fracture happened not when I was 40, but when I was like 30, and I got really into rock climbing at the time. And it was creating that existential threat, because it's funny when you do rock climbing, especially lead climbing, it's absolutely terrifying, right? Like you're probably not going to die, but it feels like you might, and you can't talk your brain out of that. but you have to. And it's funny because by going through that, then you come back to, grad school or whatever the heck you're doing with your life, the business world or whatever. And it's not that scary anymore. Like nothing really has that feeling
Yeah.
anymore. You got an important meeting with your committee or your boss, and it's like, well, I'm going to walk out of here at least,
How bad could it
My legs
be?
aren't going to be broken. It's like, and so that helped me a lot. And I think that's why we see some of these more adventure sports cropping up, especially popular with people in that phase of their life where they've kind of established some comfort. They have these psychological challenges that are starting to appear. They're in long-term relationships for the first time. They have jobs and careers and these things that can be very anxiety inducing, but it's really misplaced anxiety to some extent.
I guess we shouldn't go there, but let me go there just very briefly. There's something here that I want to think about related to what you just said, and it's also related to the fact that, and I could be very wrong about this, I think I've lost my fear of death, which I had for a long, long time. There's family history there and all that. And maybe I'm wrong. It wouldn't the least surprise me if on my deathbed suddenly,
Hope
but,
not.
but I thought I was having a heart attack a few years ago, and I was in the car with the family, and and I wasn't worried, but I thought, oh shit, if I die and both the kids are in the car, that'll really be bad. We should go to the hospital. But I have other things and so in taking it with a grain of salt, because maybe I am terrified to die, but I don't think so. I got to wondering about the multicultural psychologies of the fear of death. And well, one thing is that white guys in New England are a little cohort. And if you drop down into other cultures at other times, the fear of death that we're all supposed to have, they probably didn't, or they had it in some other way. And I was playing with that idea just very recently, and I don't know what kinds of ideas that might uh, result in.
Well, I think that we have in our modern time this very believable dream that perhaps death is something that can be escaped in a way that nobody ever did before this moment. Because the ultimate dream of medicine at this point, if you combine the overall improvements to lifespan, is to eke that over the cliff, so to speak, into the singularity, where the technology that allows the extension of life is so good that you never actually die. And that has never been the case. Like, death was something that was everywhere at all times. And
like even the fact that you never see a dead body anymore, right? I mean, think about 100 years ago, you would have seen, how many dead people would you have seen by the time you're 10 years old? Probably a lot. And today it's like, as soon as someone dies, like put a sheet over them, just get it out of, like, we don't want to deal with this. It's very, very bizarre, actually.
Yeah, it really is. A bunch of things. So death, life, and that's the desire for eternal life in that sense. Man, that's weird. I mean, there have been plenty of cultures who've thought there is eternal life, and plenty that didn't think any such thing. This goes back to my enthusiasm for Hillman in the following way. I mean, the fact of the matter is, my mother, all her life, was terrified of death, and so she couldn't live. And the move that Hillman made that helped liberate me was, for any idea, he would show that it was possible to differentiate it into lots of different versions. And then if you do any sort of cultural studies, historical, anthropological, you realize eventually that, oh my God, those people, they think this. And instead of being threatened by it, see, instead of being threatened by it, if you're an enthusiast for the poetic basis of mind, you say, oh my God, that's a possible option. Here's a way of being based on this particular vision of the shape of reality. And all these years, and maybe from my early childhood, um, there were examples of how to be fundamentalist, not in a religious sense necessarily, though that too. How to grab onto something you know is true and then live that way. And then there were all these other examples of, oh wow, what if this? What if that? What if this? And I think that's how I want to explore the world is
It's funny because that's like a better approach to science too, is what I'm coming to realize. We got really into Feyerabend recently, and this idea of scientific anarchy. I don't know if you've read any Feyerabend, but
oh yes, but
oh,
I
it's
always
so good
pronounced it
though.
differently. Yes, what was that posthumous book that one of his students published? I haven't read his stuff in a long, long time, and I used to love it.
I mean,
Yeah,
it's very similar to what we're talking about here in the metaphysical realm, but it's obviously more geared towards physicalist science. But it's like scientific anarchy. It's kind of this idea that science it's a strong link problem, not a weak link problem. Like, stop worrying about all of the garbage and look for the good stuff that's out there, and be able to hold multiple ideas in your head at once, as opposed to just having to, vote on one and move on like we understand the whole universe all of a sudden, and that's that.
and so this is a really live topic for me now because because I read Jeffrey Kripal, and so I got into the whole UFO thing maybe 2 years ago now, which I did not see coming. And so my long term interests and continuing interests in the sciences um, have come to bump up against my 30 years with Corbin's Angels and Hillman. And do you want to go there? Because I'm
I mean, I'd love to
interested
talk
in.
about UFOs, particularly. I mean, there's a whole phenomenology there to discuss, but also just the, like, how do I even broach this subject? Um, have you read Jung's book on UFOs?
I actually haven't read it, but
Okay,
I have some idea what's in it. Yeah.
so there's, the basic angle just being that this is the latest manifestation of people interpreting weird things they see in the sky since ever. And what does it mean to us that we keep seeing these things? And of course, like, you can go down the more physicalist, like, okay, maybe it's aliens, or maybe it's government uh, weapons programs, or God knows what. But there's something almost more interesting there in terms of what people's expectations are played out, how people's expectations play out in the stories they tell about these things. Which gets us back to the hermeneutic application.
Yeah. So let me bring Jeffrey Kripal into this conversation, because if anybody is out there who's interested in this kind of stuff, then you really got to read Jeff Kripal. And just to sort of set the frame for myself, every once in a while, the reductive materialist in me comes bouncing back for a repeat, and and I think that's a pretty good thing, because whatever form that takes, it serves as what we used to call a reality check, you know. And I don't want to go psychotic in such a way that I can no longer take care of myself, and my break with consensus reality becomes my connection to consensus reality becomes so fluid that I am unable to deal with the world. That there's something pathological, I think, if that happens to you, because you adopt an ontology that suggests that everything is real, which is something that which is it's What would that be? What did you call Feyerabend? And that's how I pronounce him.
Just scientific anarchy, yeah, Firebend.
Yeah, scientific anarchy. I mean, you so in
I think it's just a rare person that can entertain ideas without feeling threatened by them. I mean, it's like to hold all of these crazy ideas in your head and be like, that's interesting, or that's interesting, and that's interesting, and maybe, I don't know, maybe there's something to that, but not to have conviction in any one particular.
Well, yes, but okay, I will. Let me push back on that, as we say in podcast language these days. Let me push back on that by saying I think it's at a certain point becomes really easy to entertain all these possibilities. Oh, yeah, I mean, these things, I mean, occasionally, the Darwinist in me has a lot of trouble with creationism, but in a suitable mindset, I might be able to say, well, I certainly understand their motivations and there's yeah, but at a certain point, you've got to cook dinner. And then all that stuff just kind of bloop collapses into pot, water, heater, and everything that's connected to. So it is not possible for finite beings such as ourselves to be totally anarchist, in a deep metaphysical sense.
Well, it's funny because Feyerabend talks about that. He's like, it's not actually another institution that you jump on. It's an approach to interrogate extant ideologies and extant, institutions, right? It's not supposed to be a new set of rules that you jump into. It's supposed to be a framework for approaching extant rules and so forth.
But to elaborate on that a little bit, I think that there is a real risk because for some people it's possible to do the entertaining and then to collapse it down into something where it's, okay, it's time to cook dinner. But there's plenty of people that you meet where it doesn't seem possible. And so it spirals out into this entire galaxy of doubt and suspicion and really
ends in schizophrenia, basically.
Or some form of it, right? It ends up being this like deeply destabilizing kernel that around which it's not a pearl that forms, it is a mailstrom that forms to devour the psyche.
How close can you get to the flame, ladies and gentlemen?
That's beautiful. And so let me see if I can articulate this because there's some missing steps in my thinking here, and there have been for a long time. Because it's easy to see, it's because it's relatively straightforward to
you can't look, there's in a culture, you can't have a culture where every single person is a shaman. The shaman, right? Because there's a balance
Which is what's nuts about everybody experimenting with psychedelics all the time now, because it used to be just one guy in the tribe was the guy who was on the mushrooms, and he would kind of tell people what the hell he saw, and then people would try to bring that meaning into their lives and so forth. But you run into a real risk when everybody's the person on mushrooms, I suppose.
You guys are just an utter delight to talk to. Just an utter delight. So here's a question from Corbin's world, from my world. He's never had much of a social metaphysics or a social philosophy, and the closest he gets is the dyad, the human and their angel, from which I think we can extrapolate a theory of human relations and relations with other objects. In Corbin's world, they're all personified, not by us, but by God. So everything that is real has some aspects of personhood. Okay, so you can play with that. But then the question becomes, if you have, from the religious and theological point of view, if your monotheism is a monotheism of a community of Gnostics, each of whom has individual and, in Jungian terms, individuating access to their own angel, what kind of society results from that. And what you just said is you can't have a society where everyone is a shaman. So can you have a society where everyone is a Gnostic? Same kind of question.
And that's actually something that we're really wrestling with, because I think that this podcast is in many ways a society of Gnostics. Everyone who comes has a theory of nature, has a theory of the world. They intersect, they collide, they contradict, they support one another. And we're actively trying to figure out, is that something that can be put under some loose agglomeration of alignments that produces a functional well of knowledge and ideas that doesn't then become an institution? Because I think that institutions will always corrupt. I think that's in the designs, because as soon as you lay down the rules, you have created something that the next generation will come to and will simply take the rules as a given, as opposed to the exploration as the given.
Yes.
And that's straight out of Feyerabend. Like, he's basically like, look, and John Stuart Mill, interestingly enough.
Sure. Yes. Oh, because these ideas, I mean, smart people have had ideas like these for centuries and centuries and centuries, because it's the essence of the human condition. We want to stay alive, and in order to do that, you kind of got to control things. But on the other hand, what really enlivens you is the uncontrolled experiences. Barbara Ehrenreich wrote a book called dancing with the history of communal ecstasy or something. It's a book about celebrations and festivals over history, and let me, for my own personal purposes, just to complete the circle, this is one of the things that Ivan Illich brought to me, and I studied Ivan Illich's writings because I was trying to figure out what religion was back in the day when I was first reading Corbin, and just discovering that in order to read Corbin, I had to know something about Islam, and then I eventually sort of, I don't really even know what Christianity is, and I ended up with Ivan Illich for very good reasons. And the elevator pitch, one floor elevator pitch, is he was a radical Catholic priest who was really known to the leftists in the 60s. He didn't die till decades later. But what characterizes his vision of Catholicism is a very deep sense that the institutional structure of the church was both necessary and actually evil at the same time. And his vision, as I imperfectly understand it, for the ideal Christian community would be a relatively small group of people, each of them individually connected to their Lord Jesus, and in a very gentle, loving, communal setting. And that now kind of echoes certain forms of Buddhist ideation, at least for me, that once you've had your enlightenment moment, everything else just sort of falls into place. You don't have to convince anybody of the truth of your enlightenment. You're just sort of kind to them in spontaneous ways. And if somebody isn't kind to you, well, they might kill you, in which case it's not that important. Or you might show them that being kind is enough. You see what I'm saying? And for Illich, he was quite clear in his own mind that societies couldn't get too big. If they got too big, you're gonna default to the organizational problems, and it's all going to go literally to hell. So that any decent society, he wasn't explicitly arguing for archaic nomadism, but it certainly fits with the sort of vision of a perfect Christian community that he had, which was entirely scale dependent. And so there's that. And then the question about the community of Gnostics, if your Gnosticism is, you can't avoid this, if it's the right Gnosticism, then you don't try very hard or very seriously to convince other people that it is the right one. Or you do so in a playful mode. You say, look, here's how I see things. And then, of course, you got to realize that when you wake up tomorrow morning, oh, you got something new to play with, But what grounds you, honestly, is making dinner. And Illich would have said that. He said, what grounds you is food and feasting and festivals and, God help us, music. And those are the things that ground you. And all this falderall that we think, those are epiphenomena of the profound experience. That's a good way. Yeah. So you have this incredible experience, and all your ideation about it may or may not be useful, but those are epiphenomena. And if one of them, and this, you get this from Richard Rorty, he says, I'm a metaphysical pragmatist. I don't know what truth is, and I kind of don't care. But if I have an idea that makes me more alive, makes me a better person, I'm good for it, at least as long as it lasts.
And yet we're obsessed with this idea of being able to find the truth from which you can plant a flag or an anchor and then go forth from it. And I think that these are the two opposing forces that drive society across all of time. It's the search for a truth where you can plant a flag and operate as that being an unshakable pillar of some worldview, because it's deeply unsettling when you have a group that's large enough to have those pillars be constantly shifting.
Pardon the interruption. I just need to ask you a small favor. Please consider coming over to patreon.com/demystifysci and checking out what we've got going over there. Consider supporting the podcast directly. Keeps us from having sponsors, from selling stuff, or doing anything other than getting ready for these podcasts. We also have a really cool little community going over there. We get together once a week and chop it up about all our favorite ideas on the show and figure out, well, how we can make this a more powerful project. So come over, patreon.com/demystifysci, and I'll see you there.
Despite knowing that there is this constant reorganization of ideas and the Ivan Illich perspective of this eternally regenerating community of belief, there is the obsession with the search for truth. And I think that the
flag.
And the flag. And I think that does, in a convoluted way, lead us to Kripal.
Yes. Yeah, it does. It surely does for me. I mean, of course, and all these things, they come all together, and each way of looking at this issue of what's sort of a difference between Parmenides and Heraclitus, the one being versus the flow, and so but the trick is that what I was going to say is that there's so many different ways to frame it, and I love that image of the flag, because it's really wonderful to plant a flag, or we could come up with a somewhat better metaphor, but to solve a problem, to come to a realization, finally, this is it. Any time that something you're looking to do comes to completion or temporary fruition. Well, and I live with a woman I've been married to for many, many, many years, who's a gardener. And so her entire life, it revolves around these very slow cycles of planting and growing and harvesting. And that's always been very hard for me, because I want stuff to happen fast now. and And so I think that at every level, there's, this vegetation. You could go do the mythological version with the old cultures of, yeah, versus the masculine cultures of conquest. But there's the plant flagging. You go out, you put your bulbs in the ground. That's you know, everybody wants things to flower and produce so you can come to fruition. And one version of that is the conquistador to plant a flag. But in that kind of comparison, you could maybe teach him, maybe instead of doing that and killing all those people, maybe, you just have a garden instead and find an alternate way of establishing that.
Just conquer the weeds instead.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
there's something
exactly.
profound about the garden, though. Like, I know Peterson's talked about this a bunch, but just that the garden is sort of the natural state for man, because you're taking nature and you're ordering it in some fashion, right? It has a wall around it, right? It's not, you're not trying to like control all of nature, but you're like, this little part, like, I'm going to sort of manage this a little bit. So it does walk that line between conquering and just free-flowing whatever. It's not quite free-flowing whatever.
And oh gosh, yes. I mean, it would be really cool to have an alternate life, one of gazillions, in which, as people have done, you do a cultural comparison of garden styles. You've got your Zen garden, you've got your English garden, you have your French garden. And I read something the other day because it popped up in my Corbin search, which is on automatic, about Persian gardens back in the old days, which were, apparently we get the we get our term paradise from the ancient Persian word para something or other for this kind of walled garden of perfection, and so those kinds of metaphors, are super useful for this overall project of, gosh, I don't know,
being a human.
Being a human in a way that isn't tight and grasping and conquest. There are ways to have fulfillment without planting a flag and killing 10,000 people.
Or just killing yourself too, right? Like, I feel like the new conquest, like the new American culture, we were talking about this before the show, is just, it's like this, everything when you're a kid coming up, it's all pointing to like, you gotta like get out there and like, make your name and succeed and make yourself into something and make this empire, right? It's not necessarily about killing people or something anymore, but the metaphors still remain, right? Like, when you're really succeeding, it's like you're killing, right? It's like, that's actually a common phrase. And so it still persists at the expense of everything else.
And so wouldn't the trick then be to figure out other ways to satisfy those urges that are, more liberal?
Well, I think the sad part is when you talk to people who have really proceeded along those lines, and I count myself in some part among them, right? I really worked really hard all my life and climbed all these ladders and everything. But it's like, there's something empty about that too, right? Like, you get these accomplishments under your belt, but you're always kind of like, oh, what's next, right? It's not like this thing that ever ends where you reach. I imagine, I don't have, I'm not a millionaire or anything like that, but I imagine like once you start making lots of money, at some point you're just kind of like, I just don't know if it has the same fuel at some point. Like, if it's real, I think there's something hollow in the backside of that, which is obviously kind of cliche with money, but I think it's true too. Like, any of these achievements that you set yourself up for, these conquests, right? It could be conquering actual tribes across the world, or it could be, like romantic partners, or it could be careers, but like they're inherently empty, right? You find this emptiness on the other side of each of these conquests.
Here's a little footnote that we don't want to trace, because I do want to talk about Kripal and the weird and all that. But I try, and occasionally am successful at trying to gender balance my diatribes when I'm teaching. And suddenly the other day when I was telling the story about the angel out ahead, I sort of thought, wow, is that like really a male thing? That there's always got to be more, 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 more forever and ever. And then I thought, ooh, there's got to be some gender stuff in there that I haven't, because I find that notion of infinite, plenitude and infinite continuity, and yet ever different, to be just so fundamental to my version of paradise, because the opposite is death. Cool thing. Sorry, this becomes very chatty. On Saturday, we went out on a whale watch boat out of Bar Harbor. And I'd never been that far offshore all these years in Maine. We got out 10, 12 miles to the edge of the continental shelf, because that's where the cool water comes up for whatever hydrologic reasons, and that's where the nutrients appear, and so that's where all the organisms are, and those baleen whales, they tend to congregate there. Anyway, it was the first time I'd ever gotten out of, near shore, and it was just so great. We were on a catamaran, big one, with 100 people on it, 120-foot catamaran, which is what they do their tours on. And we were going 30 knots, man, which is really fast. And I was just standing there thinking, I'd missed my calling, man. I should have been a pirate. It
There's
was
still time.
Because it just had that feeling of that open ocean. I thought, this is it. This is heaven. I could just stand here and go forward
Yeah.
in perpetuity.
I've always hoped that there's a sailing phase in my future. I could see that.
I'd never had that. I'd always been afraid of leaving the near shore, because I thought, I'll just be at sea. And au contraire, at least for the moment, it captured some of that feeling of permanent beginner's mind. You never know what's going to come up next. Okay, let's segue.
And then you saw a UFO. No, I'm just.
Then I saw a UFO. But so here's for me the unresolved ontological questions, which is related for me to my claim earlier that no matter what possibilities you can imagine and genuinely take seriously, you burned the goddamn dinner. There are constraints that, as my wife famously says, dear, you're not paying attention, because no, I'm not. I'm just not paying attention. And it's that some things, are not abstract and ideational. There, you burned the damn dinner again. Pay attention. So in that kind of ontological sense, that's the practical, pragmatic ontology that gets thrown into question by these multiple senses of what is real. So maybe this is useful. It's a story, because I had been into Corbin for 30 years or whatever, and Hillman, and I had adopted, I thought, pretty successfully, Hillman's pluriverse kind of idea. And there's plenty of other people to get it from, but I got it from him. And it took many years for me chewing on this psychologically, but I finally did sort of cross over into being able to understand what he meant by saying, well, literalism is also a form of imagining. And that brought cooking dinner. It brought cooking dinner into the imagination, which is, it's where it is when I do it. It is, it's an image in the Jungian sense. It's burned dinner, and everything that goes with it, including the, oh shit, she's not going to be happy about this. All of that. And in a certain mood, that solved my scientific problems. That you can imagine like a geologist, you can imagine like a physicist, like a biologist. These are all different modes of imagining. You imagine like a Jungian, you can imagine like a poet, and that not that they're all the same. No, they're all wildly different, and they give you different access to reality and all these. So I was real happy with that. I had that for years, and then before I went to Brazil for the first time to have my first real psychedelic experience, this was like 2 years ago, not quite. I happened to read Eric Davis's High Weirdness, because I follow what's his name, Ezra Klein's podcast, which I listen to fairly regularly, and I know for after many years of listening to Ezra that I like his opinions, and if Ezra says something is good, I'll check it out. And he said, I don't think it was anyway. He said, "Oh, you got to read Eric Davis's High Weirdness." And I'll take a look at that. And I got a digital copy and oh man, this does look super interesting. And I sucked it down. I don't read all that much anymore. It's got to be something that really catches me. And I blasted through that book in about 3 days. And I thought, who the hell is this Eric Davis guy? Well, he's a student of Jeff Kripal, and I know Jeffrey Kripal, and here comes the Corbin connections, which is part of the substance of this for people who are listening, because we began this by saying this mundus imaginalis of Henry Corbin keeps popping up. Well, Jeff Kripal is one of the places that you will see it pop up. And just to put it in Corbinian context, one of Corbin's primary ideas is of the imaginal world, the mundus imaginalis, which is objectively real, but not materially real. Okay, and there's lots in Corbin about the ontological status of the world of the imagination, and it's pretty complicated. But you'll see it in Jeffrey Kripal. And therefore, I had met Jeffrey Kripal a couple, 3-4 years ago now at a conference at Harvard to which I was invited, which made me very happy, on Henri Corbin. And so Jeff Kripal was there. Me because of my books, and Jeff because he's a good friend of people at Harvard. He's from Rice, and he's a professor of comparative religion, and he's really good. And Jeffrey Kripal at that conference, and I knew the name, and I'd looked at the titles of some of his more recent books several years ago, and I thought, well, he's obviously insane. I don't have to pay any attention to this crackpot. And then he shows up at Harvard at the conference and he gives a talk on Henri Corbin and UFOs somehow. And honestly, nice guy, really loved him, introduced myself, we chatted, and I have no idea what he said because I just couldn't. It's like UFOs. I don't do UFOs. Who does UFOs? This is bullshit. And so I couldn't hear what he was doing up there. Subsequently, he sent me his paper after I read his books. And oh my God. Anyway, so I read Eric Davis. This was just a couple, 3-4 years ago,
Okay.
maybe 4 years ago. The Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard had an Henri Corbin conference. 3 years, maybe 4.
So this is after, because the whole UFO stuff really became more entrenched in society after the New York Times article. And that happened in 2017. And so it took a few years to percolate, but suddenly it became something that was acceptable to even touch because, it's in the New York Times.
Yes, exactly. But obviously, there's more to the story. And where Kripal comes in, him personally. So let me do this. Yes, so this was after that. And really unrelated to that, because sure. Kripal's interest in UFOs is a non-standard interest, which you'll see. This is a great story. So I'm there because of Corbin and the imaginal. And Jeffrey, I come to discover a year later, he's writing about how the concept of the mundus imaginalis is applicable to this these impossible events, among which are UFO abduction events, and we'll get to that in a minute. So I read Eric Davis's book, which everybody should read. It's just it's got everything in the kitchen, put the kitchen sink in it. Everything's in there. And I read that book and thought, whoa, okay. And then, okay, he's a student of Kripal, who I know, a nice guy. I'll look at Kripal's books. And I don't do this ever. I read 7 of his books in sequence over a period of just a few weeks. And it really screwed me up, man. And because, and here's the very short version of Jeff Kripal, he started out as a religious person, as a young man growing up in the Midwest, and thought he might go into a monastery because he was Catholic. And he went to a monastery for a while and then studied with the monks for a while. And they convinced him, and he began to see that, no, he should go to college. So being Jeff Kripal, he went to the University of Chicago and studied with Wendy Doniger, who's one of the premier scholars of Hinduism in the world. And so he got interested in Hinduism and learned the relevant languages and went to India. And while he was in India, he had a Kundalini experience. I mean, totally unexpected. It's the only transcendent experience he has ever had, but it really got his attention. There's much to be said about it. But he had gone into this interest because he was interested in mysticism, and it's part of his narrative that he was interested in what we can call extreme religious experiences, which often, but not always, are sexual in nature. Not always, but they often have a sexual component. He was interested in that for a variety of reasons. And then he had his own, which was sexual in part, but also transcendent. And then he spent...
Wait, hold on. So extreme religious experiences being sexual in nature, that's news to me.
Can
yes,
you give me an example? It was news to me too. Yeah. I'll give you an example. You ever see Michelangelo Bernini's Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, the sculpture? Go check out Bernini's Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. That's a pretty good one. She's being pierced by the arrow of the angel. Okay, so there's that.
I see.
Yeah, and so it turns out that often the sexualized nature of extreme religious transcendent experiences is downplayed in the ensuing commentaries.
In polite society.
In polite society, but it is extremely common. And Jeff got himself in a lot of trouble because he studied, I'm not real there's too much stuff in my head. I think it was Ramakrishna. There was an Indian Hindu saint at the turn of the 18th and 20th century. I think his name was Ramakrishna. And Jeff got super interested in him as a saint who had repeated mystical, transcendent experiences, which Jeffrey came to discover had a sexual component. They were kind of homoerotic. And as he will tell you happily, he'd already caught on to that at the monastery. Like a lot of these guys were kind of gay. And it's like, what is this deal about loving Jesus? It's like, that's a little weird. And so because of his own personal life too, it was like, well, this is interesting. Well, how does sex fit into all this, God the Father stuff? And so it was an area of active interest for him as a human being and as a scholar. And when he studied, I think it was Ramakrishna, he realized, wow, this is super homoerotic in many. And he wrote that in his dissertation, and he got death threats, and it was ugly, really ugly. He can't go to India. You can never visit India again because we do not talk about those things. And it's obviously not just Hinduism; it's every religion. If there's a sexual component to your religion, it's just we're not good at that. So Jeff, as a student of comparative religion for decades, was super interested in extreme religious experiences because, well, the other reason is they screw up your ontology. You suddenly realize that everything I thought was real is not real, and what's actually real was stuff I didn't have any idea was real. And I mean, think about being, well, it depends on how you understand Christianity, but think about being Jesus, or think about being Moses, or think about being Abraham, or think about being Muhammad. It's like, whoa. And even Jung will say, yeah, the experience of the living God is not always a lot of fun. It's pretty rough. So Jeff had decades of experience thinking and writing about how peculiar, extremely intense religious experiences can be. Unsettling, weird, all this. And then I'm telling this as if I knew this for a fact, but captures the feeling, I think, and it may be literally true. He's at the checkout counter at a grocery store in like 1986 or something, and he looks over and there's Whitley Strieber's book, which was, what was the first one? Communion. And he thought, oh, that looks interesting. He picks it up, and this is Whitley Strieber, the first of the high-profile alien abductees. And he wrote a book about it. And Jeff read the book, and he said, well, this is pretty clearly, it's a UFO abduction story with, all the bells and whistles, and it's pretty crazy shit. And it looks to me kind of like the Old Testament, Ezekiel with the chariot and all, and all this weird stuff happening. And he thought, wow, UFOs, they're extreme religious experiences with sexual component, and they're ontologically shocking. And he got into studying the UFO phenomenon. And that takes you down a really weird rabbit hole. But if you're a really high-end scholar of comparative religion, it kind of plugs right into the discourses that you're used to having. And then from that point of view, you look back over the history of virtually any civilization and you think, huh, right. It's not just Ezekiel's chariot, it's this. And I'm not a scholar, but whoa, this stuff, like Jung said, has been happening. Okay, short story. Then there's another Harvard connection. In 1980s, when the UFO abductions began to make it into the newspapers, the 70s and 80s, and I'm not an expert on this, but there was a lot of stuff in the papers of people being abducted by UFOs. And of course, nobody paid any attention. And one of the people that didn't pay any attention was the head of the psychiatry department at Harvard. His name was John Mack. So there's another Harvard connection. And one of his friends said, hey, you gotta take a look at some of this stuff. These people are nuts. And you're a psychiatrist, you gotta look at them. And so John Mack started to look into these abduction accounts. And he thought, wow, this is pretty cool. And he met a couple of the people and he thought, whoa, they are so totally not crazy. This is totally interesting.
Well, so it's really interesting because I read John Mack's book and I don't necessarily think that they're crazy, but I do think that all of them had deep psychological wounds across the board. Like there was definitely like a lot of trauma.
Like examples?
It was people who had been abused, people who had been in really terrible relationships, people that had ended up, I think there was one guy who was in jail and his life had been torn apart. And then as part of his revamping into a different direction, he had this abduction experience. And I felt like reading it, that Mack was very credulous without necessarily drawing the line between this vast well of trauma the search for meaning and then the patterning of meaning onto this experience.
What I try to remain creatively uncommitted. What Jeff Kripal will tell you is trauma is almost always involved in the abduction experiences. And and it's not uncommon in extreme religious experiences across the board. And here I'm shooting in the dark because I could be getting this wrong. But if you look at the training of shaman in cultures all over the world, it often involves some pretty traumatic initiations because and so take this with a very large grain of salt. In order for you to be opened up to experience other dimensions of reality, something really profound or some gang of things that are really profound need to kill your ego, need to kill you. You need to die. And so Jeff's written a lot about the importance, not necessity, but the importance and the commonness of trauma in a wide range of experiences of what he now calls the impossible. And so that would be his response to that comment, because yes, I mean, Mack was almost kicked out of Harvard. He had to fight really hard because nobody wanted to touch this. So flash forward, and to Jeff Kripal's work now, he's the founder of, or the organizer of what he calls the Archives of the Impossible at Rice University. That's where all John Mack's stuff went when he died. And it's also a repository for all sorts of wacky shit. And and to close the Corbin circle here, so it's not just UFOs that challenge our sense of reality. It's extreme religious experiences. It's certain forms of magic, certainly certain forms of psychedelic experiences. Ooh, the near-death experience phenomenon. And, there's psychics, psychokinesis, any of the parapsychological phenomena. And so what Kripal does, quite gently, I mean, he's not a systematic philosopher, but he says, if you wanted a loose worldview in which you could at least allow these things on your table, many of them to be thrown off as, ridiculous, wrong, stupid, not impossible, but not just ignored. That's his thing, because scientists, they just ignore this because it's just obviously bullshit. And his argument primarily is take all this impossible stuff and put it on the table. And then once you put it on the table, what kind of cosmology would you need to have to just even transiently put it on the table? It would be something like Corbin's Mundus Imaginalis. Actually, not very much like Corbin's actual Mundus Imaginalis, but something like, okay, so that's why he was at Harvard. And so the thing that closes the little circle for me is in that article that James Hillman wrote, in which I first heard of Henry Corbin, Hillman makes a derogatory offhand comment about parapsychological phenomenon. And he says, oh, poof, 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 that's just literalizing the imaginal. And therefore, for 30 years, that was my ability. Fine, good. I don't have to think about that crazy shit. I can think about angels and metaphysics and God, but I don't have to deal with bullshit. And then I read Eric Davis and got sort of sucked into this weird world. And then I read Jeff Kripal, and at least for a while, man, okay, so maybe. And then I revisited that article and I realized, oh my God, I had set up this wall where there's behind which I'm not going to think about that shit. That's absurd. And it fell down with a thud. And then I was, oh, fuck. So what do I do now? And that was the same time that when I was reading the last of Kripal's books, that's when I was in Brazil to take iboga. And so all of these things sort of all came together. And I was sort of ontologically unsettled when I had my first substantial psychedelic experience.
What was that experience like? Because iboga is a particularly difficult one, from what I've read.
So here's the short version of the story. I have a good friend who's been in a number of my classes, and he's become an even better friend who's Brazilian. And after I'd been down there for the iboga, he said to me, well, you're talking about this mundus imaginalis thing in the imaginal world. And I knew you were full of shit. I knew you didn't know what you were talking about. So I thought to myself, he's got to come down here and do the iboga. And in a very real sense, he was totally right, because I'd played around with psilocybin a little bit, didn't have any. I mean, I now know where the Grateful Dead posters came from in the 60s, but that's about it. There was nothing transformative. So I told a good friend of mine who's an ayahuasca person that I was going down to Brazil to do some iboga. And she said, oh my God, you shouldn't do that. It's really intense and you'll die. And I said, well, I'm going to do it. But I didn't prepare myself at all. There's metaphysical things to be brought out of this in a moment. So it's not just a personal story. Because as we learned from Henry Corbin, your cosmology is always a psychocosmology. And to think with science that you can just easily be objective is no, you can't. Not really. And so whatever you think is objective truth, you think that in large measure because of who you are. And it's a very good thing to try to tease those apart, but it's not easy to do. So I went down there, having just been ontologically undone, at least theoretically, and participated in this ceremony. And my friend Marco says, well, iboga is not a psychedelic because he's got lots of experience. And he says, I don't know what it is, but it's not a psychedelic. It's different. Take-home message. I was totally unprepared for what I was getting into. And it reminded my critical faculties of all those bullshit flower children hippies back in the 60s, where, there's all this goofy ritual, and I just wanted the drug, damn it. That's why I came all the way down here. Just give me the damn drug. And there's 4 days of ritual and all this bullshit. And I was like, all right, fine. We finally get to, it's a big deal. We finally... I was an asshole. And we finally get to taking the drug, and the drug didn't want me. She gave me a really, it's a her for me. And I think for many people, it is a her. And she showed me blockages, and she kind of spat me out the other end, and it was very dark and extremely unpleasant. And I refused to participate the second night, where you take a little bit more. But the important part is that I came through that experience, the plant medicine itself, but everything else that went with it. I came to realize, oh man, I am just nothing but defenses. Rational defenses, irrational defenses. I am not. No, no, I'm not. Nope. And yet, the end of the ceremony on the last day, when everybody's doing a communal thing, I had a profound, very fleeting, but very profound feeling of the cosmic feminine. That's all I can really say about it, and it doesn't do it justice. But it was like, oh my God! And I started to weep a little bit, and it was really profound. And I knew immediately I'm coming back, to do this again. A year later, I come back, and this time, okay. I know what the whole ceremony is. I know these people. I'm pretty sure I'm cool. And if I'm not, that's cool too. But I'm not the same asshole I was. So I stripped naked for the initiation. I went through the whole thing pretty, more or less enthusiastically. And I wasn't done yet. This time I had 4 times as much plant medicine as I did the first time. And it was 36 hours of the most wretched misery. I vomited black shit, and it was just all. And the important thing was that even at the time, work was being done on me at a somatopsychic level or something, at a level that I certainly was not able to do this kind of dark, sticky, nasty. At a certain point, I woke up and cleaned out my bowl, and it was full of all this black stuff. And I looked up at our Nima, our shaman, and he said, he was so excited. He said, "This is fantastic." And I just said, "Oh my God, I can't." And congratulations. This is so great, And so during that whole 36 hours, this is it. I'm never coming back again. This is so awful. As soon as it was over, okay, I'm coming back because now I'm done, man. Now maybe not. One more thing happened in that 4-day experience was, again, just so quickly that it almost didn't happen. But within a half an hour or so of eating the plant medicine, before I plummeted into the flames, literally. I mean, no, figuratively, but literally, if you're in them. I saw a female figure at my upper left, and she had what was either her finger or a gold ring, and I interpreted her in this flash of offering me something that if I'd grabbed onto it, she would have pulled me out of what was coming, but I couldn't hear her, and I was just turning to say, I can't end, and I was in it. I think that's what the Bwiti people of Gabon call your Mumbayano, or in Corbin's term, it's your personal angel. And she was like, I'll give you a fraction of a second here, otherwise you're in it. And I couldn't hear her, which is characteristic of a white guy from New England doing a Gabonese initiation experience. As soon as I was done with that, though, I'm going back at the end of October to see what happens the 3rd time. And one more metaphysical thing. Somebody asked me, because I was discussing this with some of the students, well, that woman you saw, do you think she was real? And my own response kind of flips me out, and I like it. I said, I don't care. Because it's not the right category. I don't know. Me, the philosopher and ontologist, I don't actually give a shit whether, why would you ask? It's a category mistake if I flick back into my philosophical mode. Doesn't matter at all to me. I want to go back down and see what happens next with no expectations, because I had expectations. Last time I thought I'd get, really good stuff. No. Yeah.
I mean, there's a real debate to be had about whether the world's made out of atoms or made out of stories. It's, you can
Yeah.
see it from both sides for sure. But I think there's something really interesting about all of these experiences, the religious experience, the UFO experience, the psychedelic transformation. You can obviously have it through intense physical exertion or near-death experiences. There's something about your past, you call it the ego, but there's something about who you are that is allowed to be kept, like, put behind you, so to speak, in each one of these, that breaks, that allows you to be a different version of yourself. And I feel like that's why in often cases you see people who are already traumatized and want to get rid of their old self, like they're burdened by their self. They're the ones who are often attracted to these experiences, I feel like. But it's a little bit tragic because there's people who everything's been more or less going all right for them their whole lives, and they still accumulate a lot of baggage along the way, but they're not really open to having any of these experiences. And so either it comes out in the form of having a UFO experience or something hits you over the head basically and makes you have it. But I feel like those are the people in some sense that need it the most too, because they don't realize what they're not seeing at the same time. I guess my to wrap that, my point is that I'm not sure if the death of the ego is a result of what happens, or if, like you said at the beginning, it's something that you should be prepared for. Like, you shouldn't come into it with too much without having dealt with your ego in the first place. And it's like, that's a chicken or egg situation for me, because I feel like you're not going to get away with it if otherwise. Like, your ego is not going to remain intact in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I feel love, and I find this very nice. I have no authority. I just have my experiences thus far. I'm a little, because one of the things that supposed to go along with the death of the ego is kind of panic attack, fear. The first experience, I briefly had kind of panic a little bit because it's quite intense. It's quite physical and intense, when, at least in my two experiences. And my initial reaction was like a panic attack, and then it just went away. And I'm 72, and I've had weird things psychologically and so I was just able to say, oh, there's panic, and just let go of it, which one can learn. But I'm still a little worried.
I think a lot of people, even, that's like, there's a certain type of person too who will just be like, they'll have tried cannabis or something at some point, and they have that same feeling, right? And so they're like, I don't like that stuff, because that's the thing about psychedelics, is they're not, it's not like alcohol where you just tune out of reality and like everything goes. It's actually this really examining state of mind where you're like, and people will be like, I felt paranoid. And I'm like, yeah, well, you're supposed to. Like, that's actually good for you. Like, you should lean into that. Like, listen to what's freaking you out about yourself. Maybe there's little pieces of you that you don't need to be clinging to.
There's a really funny scene in Curb Your Enthusiasm where Larry David smokes weed for the first time, and he's just this incorrigible asshole. And he's in the bathroom staring at himself in the mirror, processing the horror at realizing who he is, and he just cannot shake himself out of it, which I just feel is so illustrative.
It's just funny because I just feel like there's the type of person who would like lean into that and be like, okay, like, this is good. I'm getting information about. It's almost like a growth mindset about about your journey, versus like, oh my God, this is lying to me. It's not. This isn't good. I don't want to face this because it's not really me. I couldn't be like that. Like, I'm just never gonna touch this kind of experience ever again. And it's funny. I just meet people who really fall neatly into either one of those categories.
So I kind of think that I went down to do the Iboga the first time without doing any prep. I didn't look it up. I had no idea what the ceremony. Because you could look that stuff up, like the fact that they stopped giving you caffeine like 2 days before. So for 3 days, I had this splitting headache because I didn't see it coming. I could have known everything because they tell you up front what's going to happen. I think I did it that way unconsciously because otherwise I wouldn't have gone.
Mm.
And I kind of pretty consciously knew I got to go down and do something that has the biggest possible hammer, because I've got such a defended structure here after 70 years of whatever, that I probably need to be hit with the biggest hammer to get through it. And whether that's true, I don't know, but it seems like, yeah. And so I'm happy that I want to go down to do it at least one more time. And I don't know what the state of mind is. It's kind of, I kind of would, I don't know, I'd kind of like to think it's open non-expectation. I know something will happen. But I guess I'm kind of hoping in my nirvana, this would be my version of beginner's mind. Let's just go see what happens. And if it kills me, well, my children and wife will be upset. But and if it could possibly be worse than last time, I suppose, but I don't think so. So it's likely, at least, it's been so profoundly moving.
Yeah, you talk about it almost like a cleansing. I mean, I don't know, but I don't like that word, but unsticking, you said, of things, and it's kind of like cobwebs and like
it seems
adhesions being broken.
People say this about the plant medicines, is that the medicine knows what you need and will give it to you. And before 2 years ago, I mean, that's obviously bullshit. And now, okay, how does that work? Not a clue. I will tell you one thing that helped me a lot. The guy who's our shaman, and they call, in the Bwiti tradition from Gabon, they call him a Nima. Our guy Gregory is actually a white guy from France who came to Gabon in the French army and got sucked into the Bwiti tradition. And studied for, I don't know, 12 or 15 years before he was consecrated. And then he thought he would go somewhere, and he ended up in Brazil. But he's really good. There's a lot of stories I could tell. But the important one is that in his initial spiel to the initiates, the first time he said this, I thought, okay, I'm in spite of all my resistances. He says, this is a long tradition. It's got thousands of years of history, and you got all these rules and things you have to do. He says, but if anybody ever tells you that they know what's going on here, it's bullshit, because we are leading you into mystery, and nobody understands it. And at that point, that first time, I thought, okay, this is okay. I like this guy. He says, I'm really experienced. I can help you with any troubles you get into, but this is mystery, man. And that, for me, that's heaven, and yeah. I think
you need to have mystery. When you live in a world where there's nothing mysterious left, it's like you've caught the angel, to bring it back to that.
And to bring it around to the sciences, because to bring it around to natural history, and first of all, it's natural. It's an obvious thing to do because we live in nature. So there you are. I mean, there's wood, and there's fabric, and there's insects, and there's plants, and I fell in love with that long ago, and eventually became a scientist. But I was never really a scientist. I was a naturalist, and so there's a what. What happens when you go to grad school in the sciences? Any of your romanticism and your touchy-feely stuff gets stomped into oblivion. I mean, the best of us keep it alive anyway, because it's what brought you into it in the first place. But they kind of got to do that to keep up appearances. But all of the best people in the sciences are still doing it because there's something they love there. And there's lots of ways to go with mystery. But if for me, and I have psychological and familial reasons that I could articulate. My students know all about my family history. It's to keep the world alive, because damn it, it is alive. And what Corbin and Hillman did for me was to show me that, oh yeah, the world's alive, and it's up to you to participate in to participate in that process. And the way in which human beings do that is various. In a secular society, it's art and music, but in a non-secularized society, it can also be religions, or however we
Mystery traditions in general, yeah.
Yeah, mystery traditions, exactly. And so psychedelics are a mystery tradition. So is magic. So are the arts.
I mean, so is I was gonna say, so is music on a good day for me, right? It's
Yes.
like, where the hell am I
Yes.
going with this? I'm just going somewhere. I don't know where. But
a book. No, let me shut up for a minute. I got a book for you. Make sure you read.
oh, go ahead. Yeah. No, I was just thinking this
Okay.
kind of ties in. You just had this quote in one of your lectures about learning to see the soul of the world, and I feel like that's
Yeah.
what we're kind of circling around right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so that's a big deal for Hillman and Corbin. The notion of the soul of the world. To continue Hillman a little bit, he became, in my view, there's good reason to think this. I'm not just making it up. He became less and less a Jungian psychologist and more a Renaissance Italian humanist. That's where his heart began to migrate south out of Switzerland and Germany and Northern Europe into Italy and the southern Mediterranean. And in that particular essay that he writes about where Corbin appears, The Thought of the Heart, he draws on the pre-Socratics and on Marsilio Ficino and the Renaissance Neoplatonists who were doing exactly that. They were philosophers, but not in the modern sense. They were philosophers in the Renaissance Italian sense, and they were particularly interested in whatever means they could develop for reanimating or resuscitating or maintaining the human connection with the soul of the world. And you see that in someone like Leonardo. Michelangelo.
I just got done reading his biography. It was
fascinating. Look, while we're on this subject, I have two books that have just really been useful to me in the last 4 or 5 years on this in this mess that I would highly recommend to everyone. First, I'll mention Kaya Silverman's Flesh of My Flesh, which is an astonishing piece of work on many levels. I forget where she's based. But she's an art historian, maybe primarily, but trained in philosophy, and she may be a practicing artist too. And that book has the outline of what is becoming her practice of the cosmology of analogies. And she says in there somewhere, analogy will save us. So there's that. But in that book also is her presentation and commentary on the life and work of Lou Andreas Salome, the woman who was a student of and colleague of Freud, and a companion and intellectual equal of Nietzsche, and Rilke's lover. And I knew her name as obviously being a woman of some intensity. If those are your best friends, then you're operating at a pretty intense level of humanity. And so we could do this later, maybe, if you want to, but Silverman's analysis and presentation of Salome's psychocosmology was totally transformative for me. So there's that book. The other one that's pertinent to this part of the discussion is, oh God, what's the guy's name? It's called The Jazz of Physics, and it's written by Stefan Alexander. And so for a number of years, when I was younger, I played the guitar, and I now recognize that it's what saved my soul when I was a young kid. And I never learned anything about music. I zero. For me, playing the guitar was total freedom. So I don't know anything. I became good, but I never played with anybody, so I'm actually bad. But I now realize that it was the one place in my life where I could be arguably pretty dexterous and good and really, really love what I was doing. And there were no rules except the ones that I did for myself. And so music has always been super important to me. And it's also super important to Henri Corbin. One of the things that allows the easiest access for some people into Corbin's cosmology is it's based in many respects. It's based not just on hermeneutics, but it's based on hermeneutics if your hermeneut were a musician like Orpheus. So if you meld Hermes and Orpheus, you get Corbin, you get access via the arts into Corbin's cosmology, which is hierarchical and angelological, and it's got layers, but they're all linked by musical analogies. And in Corbin, that often they appear. He was a keyboard player, Corbin, and so the musical analogies are there. And so
it has like a Blakean thread to it too. I was a huge fan of Blake when I was in my 20s.
It does. It does. And Corbin, to my knowledge, doesn't ever mention the British Romantics pretty much ever, I think. He certainly would have known of them, but he had enough ground to cover with Goethe and Rilke. He knew the Germanic tradition super well. But yes, if you wanted this to slop over into well, that's what the poets were doing when they were reading Corbin. They said, "Oh,
I think Blake was wrestling with that institutionalism of it, right? And I think that the Germanic traditions are closer to the indigenous, pre-Christian indoctrination and all of that institutionalization, right? So it's probably a little bit closer to the flame, so to speak.
There's volume 3 of the Poems of the Millennium series by the University of California Press. Volume 3 is Romanticism and later, and it's edited by Jerome Rothenberg and a guy whose name I'm going to forget, who was a scholar of Romanticism, all of it. Corbin has been called the last of the German Romantics. The reason I mention the Poems of the Millennium series is that the introduction to that by Rothenberg and Robinson, it's Jeffrey Robinson, the introduction to that is just fantastic. Because it provides a reading of the Romantics and their successors, which just plunks right down in a conversation of Henri Corbin, and shows. Although I don't think they mentioned Corbin would fit right into their analysis of many. He would fulfill many of their criteria for what are the most important characteristics of Romanticism. And of course, not just as a literary movement, but as a life. These people were trying to show us how to live lives which were stoked in the imagination, so it fits with that. to come back to Stefan Alexander, the reason I ran across his book was because I was teaching courses on music, about which I know absolutely nothing. And I think we did 5 of them, and they were fantastic. It was just really cool for me to learn a little bit. It was in and around the issues that should come up if you think about music. And I maybe in the third of those, I was Googling things, and Stefan Alexander's Jazz of Physics was, yeah. So let's say, first, because I love physics. I didn't have the mathematical chops to be a physicist, but I love physics. So Stefan Alexander is a professor of theoretical physics at Brown University. He's also a black guy and a really good jazz saxophone player. So he really knows music. He knows jazz, and he really knows theoretical physics. And the argument that he's making in there, it still gives me goosebumps, because it's just the kind of thing when two things come together that you knew they might. And he says, well, first of all, he tells the wonderful story about Einstein. Somebody asked Einstein, where do your ideas come from? And he said, well, they're really musical ideas. And apparently Einstein's wife said, oh, yeah, he'd get stuck. He'd be writing, doing his, and he'd get stuck, and he'd come play the piano for a while. And then he'd go back into his study and back and forth. And so Einstein's like, they're kind of musical ideas. Then it also turns out that John Coltrane, there's all sorts of Coltrane stories. Coltrane and not Ornette Coleman, but the other guy, whose name is going to escape me because I'm finite. And Stefan Alexander, to cut to the chase, says, he says there's this when you really, really begin to understand music, and none of this would be a surprise to Pythagoras, right? When you really begin to understand music, and you really begin to understand, the abstract spaces in which music can exist, if you're the right kind of mind, because they're n-dimensional, sonic spaces. And if you're a theoretical physicist, or Einstein, or I guess John Coltrane and a few others, your understanding, and there's great literatures on this, your understanding of the relations between chords and notes and modes, and this becomes this extraordinarily complex oral space. And then you turn around and you do theoretical, physics, and you realize, gosh, some of these ways of thinking are analogous. And he says, they never they generally don't quite match up. And then he says, but it's when they don't match up that creativity happens. At which point I just thought, oh God, because that's where your structures don't work, and that's where the magic happens. I mean, it's just such a great metaphor. And the book is brilliant. It's full of anecdotes about all different kinds of music and people I would never have thought, it's just a piece of genius, or at least for me, it totally validated my intuition on the basis of nothing that all this stuff could hang together some way. I mean, I never had those experiences of mathematics, but I can kind of pretend that I know what that is like. And therefore, somebody like Corbin, he wouldn't really give a shit about the theoretical physics, and neither would he give a shit about the jazz, but he'd say, well, of course they're all related harmonically. How could it be any other way? That's how everything's built. And he would have added, some animism, some personhood into those.
I mean, you could write a wave equation for a symphony or something, right? I mean, you could theoretically have like enough factors that you keep adding these additional you can Fourier transform any wave into its composite pieces, but it's like, are you really gonna have an understanding of the symphony once you've done that necessarily? Right?
Right.
So sometimes the closer you get to the actual symbolic representation, the less meaning is even available to you.
Yeah. 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 And what do we take home from that? I don't know. I don't know.
Well, we can bring it because we do spend a lot of time with physics too, and we can bring that understanding into our approach to physics too. Because a lot of times when we get obsessed with physics, people accuse us of being materialists, which is really funny to me. Because
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, it's just an inappropriate accusation. Like if you know me at all, but I'm still curious about that approach too. At the same time, it's not that I think it's the approach, right? I don't know why physicists have this almost knight-like status in our society. Like it seems ridiculous to me, but it is one way of looking at things. And there's so many different ways of looking at the same thing, right? I mean, maybe you see it as a symphony instead of a bunch of wave equations, but there's actually this really cool, I came across this guitarist lately. I think his name's Stanley Jordan. Do you know this guy? He kind of
No.
invented like the tap guitar thing.
Okay.
But he did a YouTube video recently where he goes through the periodic table and plays the tones
Oh,
for
wow.
the excitation states of each one of the
Okay.
atoms and attempts to make some music out of it and stuff. And it's pretty cool stuff. I mean, there is definitely that overlap that's available if you're looking for it.
Not only that, but it's the expansion of possibility that is required to actually be able to do science. Like you said something about how when you go to grad school, it's hammered out of you this sense of something that's much bigger than the data or the ion channel or whatever structure on the flea that you're studying. You come with the sense that as a biologist you'll learn about life. And what you learn is really you learn either some kind of biochemistry or biophysics or pathways or complex network analysis. And you're left with this eternal burning question of what more binds it together. What is the whole picture of life and the cosmos that you can acquire? And science limits you because by its very nature, it's a series of models that cannot fully intersect.
Yeah.
And yet they must, because you have a continuous experience of the cosmos. And so
It's also funny because the project inherently unravels all these details without being able to create a summation at the same time. Like it gets further and further away from the summary, the more details that are illuminated.
like most biologists don't have a definition for life. Or
Right.
they do, but it's a series of things of, it maintains homeostasis, it divides, it has genetic material, and you're like, really? That's the foundation for everything that we do downstream?
So I find maybe, yeah, one of the things is I'm kind of stuck in this, I'm kind of stuck with a framing that I established without actually trying to some years ago now. And I'm interested to think about it in this context about the sciences. For whatever reason, since I was a little tiny guy, I don't know, 8 years old, I wanted to be a theoretical physicist, and I didn't. I didn't twice for lots of reasons. But there's something, and like you said, first of all, so I can just quickly and articulately, there's something very peculiar about theoretical physics. There's also something really beautiful about it. But let's set it aside for a minute as the knight among the sciences. It was Stephen Gould, the Harvard biologist, said that all the other sciences had physics envy, and he said, that's too bad. But we can set it aside because almost nobody can do it. So we'll set it over there, and we'll put mostly biology in the other sciences, but any of the other sciences, and a multi a pluriverse version of reality is kind of easy to see if you're a dilettante in many natural sciences, and that would be me. For a while I knew quite a lot of biology, but particular kinds of biology, and then I played around as a botanist, and oh wow, you start noticing different things. Oh my God, I didn't know there were so many plants. For a while, I got super interested in geology. Oh, whoa, super, oh my God, the things you start paying attention to. And so we'll just stick with those three examples, and you could pick anything. You pick sociology, economics, and medieval history. It doesn't matter what if you're looking at the world through those different lenses, you just see different things, and it enriches your experience of the world. And theoretical physics, if you're good at it and it doesn't comment at all, well, the first time I ever took a physics course, and the first, so you learn projectile motion, and the question that flipped me out at the time was, what happens if that's an explosive that's going through its parabolic arc? What happens to the center of mass of all the particles if it blows up? And when I realized that, oh, nothing, center of mass just keeps going on its merry way, all of a sudden everything was different for me. Oh my God, and it's not so much that you can understand it, at least for me. It's, oh my God, look what I see now. Or complex systems theory. Oh my God! Look at the cool shit. Oh my God! I had no idea that the world. So for me, it was always a question of seeing things in different ways. That's what's enlivening. And then, here's the thing I'm kind of actively worried about now, having to do with Kripal and the UFOs, and honestly, the multiculturalism that comes from anthropology, and what is Viveiros de Castro calls it, the epistemologies of the South, people who are not Western European descendants, who just don't see the world in this scientific way. What about the rocks? What about cooking? What is that? What is that thing that allows me to go to Peru and meet a Peruvian shaman and have an experience with a person who I will never understand, and vice versa? And then, of course, with the climate change thing.
And why the hell are there even these plants that do this to us? Like, that's just such a bizarre coincidence. I mean,
why are there these plants that do this to us? And I guess in one, first of all, there's the philosopher's question of how, if at all, do I talk about, Kant pointed to the thing in itself, and that was, we don't do that much anymore, but everybody gets what he was after. And you kind of want to talk, because everybody knows that, as Karen Barad, the quantum physicist woman, Karen Barad said, reality does push back. It's not like it's all mundus imaginalis. Reality pushes back. And is there, as Westerners have assumed for a couple dozen centuries, is there an objective way to talk about it or not? And there kind of doesn't seem to be. And yet we're going to all die because we did something wrong. To what? We're not quite sure. So there's that question. And then there's in give me a second. Because here's the thing that it really comes down to for me. And it's a political question. So I think we could, how did you put it? You had it really lovely. Illich's table, a bunch of communal Gnostics, that would be heaven, and they managed to figure out how to cook a meal together, which would be the best possible metaphor for knowing how to live with other beings on the planet. So they cook a meal together and they enjoy each other's company and they continue being diverse in their Gnostic experiences. But we don't have that. We instead have this problem that there's a lot of people, myself included, who think that the world should be one way. And then there are people over here that think that the world should be another way. And things go off. And the Enlightenment project was beautifully, well, look, if we just all would be rational about this and get rid of religious foolery and magic and all that stuff, which is obviously bullshit, and we just reason together like rational people, we will come to a conclusion that we all can agree with. And it didn't work out very well because different people give you different answers, but
yeah, it turns out you need a pretty big stick to enforce that consensus.
Yeah, and why is that? Well, and here's where it gets way out of my pay grade. It doesn't. It turns out not to be easy to have people ignore their emotions. Mm-hmm. And if they ignore their emotions, then you're all dead. And that isn't what you wanted, And if you don't ignore your emotions, well, how far do you, well, I ignore them up to a point, but, how do you, and who's to say what, and so but if you agree that there is no rational framework, then you end up with something like John Stuart Mill. But what I'm more interested in right now is the problem that somebody like Kripal or me or Jeff Davis or any one of a number of postmodern, people who are postmodern philosophers have, because probably most theologians, philosophers, sociologists, folks in the humanities have kind of admitted that going for a single unified view of reality is both colonial and damaging and probably actually wrong. And I want to do this in a pointed way and quickly because it's too huge a topic to really even broach. In Eric Davis's book, High Weirdness, he talks about this repeatedly. It's not the structure of the book, but the book High Weirdness and Jeffrey Kripal's account of impossible realities is about the discussion of the multiple structures of realities that begin to manifest when you start playing with non-reductive ontologies. That would be one way to say it. And Davis is quite clear that, oh, yeah, you get conspiracy theories and you get every crazy person, and it becomes really hard to distinguish like the Proud Boys from your best friends because they both believe really peculiar things with no ground in reality. But if you've given up reality because it's too colonialist, then why do you want to kill those people and embrace these people? And I have great trouble even articulating the question, but it seems to me at the 21st century, we're in the same kind of muddle that people were when they said, let's do the Enlightenment. And that's going to clean it all up.
There is the search for a shared reality, because if you look at any of the discourse over misinformation or disinformation, that's really what it comes down to, is the idea that there is some window of facts or events that are basement truth, and you can operate with those as your foundation, and anyone who doesn't agree with those precepts has fallen off the wagon and cannot be let back into the club until they agree that this is the platform on which everything exists. And so I think you're right that we're at this point where there's a fracturing of possibilities, and our task is to figure out how to exist within that fracture in a way that we don't get lost, because it's very easy to get lost in that. It's like the dark woods.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of things in the woods that'll kill you.
Yeah. You know, I mean, I often have the sense that I'm making this way too complicated. It's really simple.
I don't think it is simple. I think that it's
Yeah.
incredibly difficult, because we have reached a point where information is so abundant, and then we have on top of it a sea of information that's being manufactured that is not real in any way, because it's generated by some computer program that's made a video that looks perfectly identical to reality, and you actually can't tell that it's no longer a representation of something that has happened. And so it really starts to tear at the fabric of what is. And we've succeeded on the back of being able to say that this is. This is. You can point to something and you can say that this is, and we can operate from that. And postmodernism has been incredibly damaging in that sense, because it's like, well, no, there isn't an is. And you could argue about that at some point because the technology hadn't gotten to the point where it could really erase the is. But now we have slammed full force into this massive, I see it as there's this the Flammarion engraving. Where's the one? It's the dome of the earth, and then there's this guy who's on his knees and he's reaching into the stars.
Yeah.
It's kind of we've broached the barrier of reality to such a degree that it is starting to fray. And our task now is to figure out how to live in a world where reality is completely fractured.
Also, just like coming to peace with the concept of complexity. I think that we, in our initial rational investigation of nature, expected it to be complicated, right? Like a machine or something that is, it's got a lot of moving pieces, but we just need to inventory them to the point that, okay, it can be sorted out. But it's not complicated. Nature is not complicated. It's actually just unendingly complex. Like no matter how deep how many expansion terms you have in your wave equation, you're gonna have to renormalize it eventually, right? Like you're gonna lose stuff. You can't possibly capture everything, and so that struggle is just something that fits in line with what you're saying. It's this unending project,
which we really run into as we're doing science, because science has for the last 50 years been this objective practice where there's the eyeball of the scientist looking out onto the world, telling you what is, and now you have a paper that you can use to support basically any perspective that you have on how nature works, because the sheer number of papers that are out there, all in conflict with one another, none of which can reproduce, and so we're at sea, and it requires something that is not quite the Enlightenment. And people always talk about, we should bring back the Enlightenment, all these Enlightenment values. And I'm like, I think that was born of a specific time and a specific, it was an emergence from this very structured reality of a churchly doctrine.
Yeah.
Where it was easy to say that this is the thing that we're pushing against. It gives us stability. It gives us integrity of beliefs to say that this is what we're trying to take apart. And now it's like, okay, well, how do you build something out of this sea of particulate matter? Where is the center of mass that allows everything to orbit in peace without just massive collisions all of the time, breaking everything apart again?
One of the things that occurs to me is that Illich would say, well, you just can't organize a society beyond a certain size. He was really interested in problems of scale. And he'd say, no, this global society it ain't going to happen. And so I was musing about the fact that my ontological and political problems, if I could imagine we were a group of people cooking dinner together, one thing that people say this all the time, and I know it's true. I've got some neighbors who were, they're politically insane, and they live I know I actually used to work with people who lived in the Fox News universe, and yet they're really cool. I mean, my friend and I, we shared the same music. We loved the same music, so we just didn't talk politics, and and therefore, if your society is of an optimum size, you know everybody, and so then you have. And I don't know that the scales. Then you have the opportunity to say, this is how we make coffee in this house. And if you want to make it a different way, that's okay. You probably, you're going to have to use, because something's got to heat it. And so you can actually agree on the thermodynamics of the stuff. And you can agree, and then you imagine that you're with someone who has this Gnostic experience of a God that he wants to impose upon you. And if there's only 12 or 20 of you, you could say, well, actually, no, and you can do John Stuart Mill on him and say, you're probably right, but it really pisses me off that you're trying to make me believe that too. And it's not going to happen because I'm resistant. Maybe I'll come along, show me that that's a great way to live. And maybe I'll eventually get hit by the heart of Jesus or something. And you can totally imagine a world like that. I mean, and now we're doing science fiction. I mean, I immediately was putting us in a little room and everybody had a different video feed of what the outside world was like. And here's the thing I'm into right now. Because to try to answer these questions and to address these questions, which are wildly complicated, and they're theological and metaphysical and ontological and sociological and psychological all at once, what do? You write fiction about it. And to handle the contemporary world, you write science fiction. And I had the most amazing thing happen, just a bunch of synchronicities, and I'm not the only person to recognize this. But in Eric Davis's book, High Weirdness, the last part of that book is about Philip K. Dick, the science fiction author I guess he died in the 80s. And when I was a little kid, I read nothing but science fiction. Well, I went to college, I read nothing but science fiction. And I wish I'd continued and just given up on all that philosophy stuff. And to discover that Philip K. Dick was like, it's got this interesting thing. And anyway, so Eric Davis and then going through Kripal, who talks a lot about literature and comic books and science fiction, all of them from a point of view of extreme experience and psychedelics and all this, so wonderful. And I'm thinking, well, this is cool. I should teach something about this because it connects me to my childhood. And if you're in this little circle of interests around Corbin and alternate realities, you're likely, and psychedelia, etc., you're likely to run across William James, legitimate philosopher and psychologist, and both Kripal and any number of people draw on James for good reason. And Henri Bergson, who I didn't know much about, but a lot of people like to resuscitate Henri Bergson because his metaphysics can be kind of useful in playing with these realities, quasi-scientific and, all this other stuff. And just to complete the story, there's this French philosopher from the 1900s who was really important for Henri Corbin. His name was Etienne Souriau, and he was totally forgotten by everybody, except in this extremely crucial footnote in Corbin's book on Ibn Arabi. So I knew of him. Bruno Latour, who you guys probably have heard of as a contemporary philosopher of the sciences and other things, discovered Etienne Souriau 10 years ago or so. And so Bruno Latour becomes in this circle. And so anyway, I know all these names. And then I was Googling Philip K. Dick like a month or two ago, and I find this contemporary French philosopher named Lapoujade, David Lapoujade, who's just published a book about Philip K. Dick. And I look up Lapoujade. He's a legitimate philosopher. And lo and behold, he's written a book called Worlds Built to Fall Apart. It's about Philip K. Dick. And I think, oh man, okay, this is great. And I look at his previous books, Henri Bergson, William James, and Etienne Souriau. Nobody writes about Etienne Souriau. And now he's written a book about Philip K. Dick. So in the fall, we're going to do a course reading Lapoujade's book, because all of these things, they come together because all of these people, well, at least Philip K. Dick, in his prescient science fiction, he saw this confusion, not perfectly clearly, but he saw what was going to happen with things like the internet and multiple realities and pills that you could change your view of. And so these issues are not only, and the dark sides of them, because to connect back to Eranos and to bring the Enlightenment project in here, in contradistinction to Corbin and even Jung, the Eranos conferences got a lot of heat from the more Enlightenment-oriented scholars of religion and history and the sciences and psychology, because they said, oh, these people, they're revivifying mythology, and we know what happens when people play with mythology. You get the Nazis, you get QAnon. I mean, people go insane. You get UFOs, you get conspiracy theories. And where I happen to find myself standing is, oh shit. So now, given these various pluralisms, which I think have such potential for revivifying, what do we call it? The re-enchantment of the world. So how do I become the 12-year-old science fiction reader without becoming a Proud Boy or a QAnon person? Is there a way to, you can't just say rationality anymore. It didn't work. But what kinds of persuasive things do you do instead? Period. Yeah.
And I think that's a good place to put a pin in it, because that's the project that we're on as well. We're trying to figure it out. And the only way that you really can is by diving into it, knowing that the answers are not available yet. It is the exploration. It is John Wesley Powell on the Colorado River. Like, this might not end well. I don't know.
No, that's exactly right. It might not end well. Risk.
But it's definitely going to end.
I don't know. Not if Kurzweil has his way.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, Tom, it's been really, really fun to talk to you, man. We've done, I think, more than 3 hours here, which is just flown by.
It's a gas. I thank you so much. I mean, honestly, beyond you can cut it or not, but thanks, you guys. This is really,
thank you.
Really a joy to talk to you guys, because we're kind of on the same whatever here. Yeah, we're involved in the same kind of issues and the same kind of.
I'd be down to meet up again after you've been through this Philip K. Dick thing too, because that's one of my, I don't know what you would say.
He was the first sci-fi author that I really read and fell in love with.
There's just like a few of those artists, that really, really inspire you, and so I'd really love to dig into the symbology and the
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll see
What's
how
that word?
where this
Dang it, I
goes.
forgot already.
Hermeneutics?
The,
Hermeneutics?
Hermeneutics of
Hermeneutics.
Philip K.
Yeah,
Dick. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
Maybe we
Oh,
could
no,
miss them. Yeah,
totally, it
maybe
totally
we
is
could meet
that.
up again next year and
Sure.
talk about that.
Yeah.
I also want to
After,
hear about your next
Oh yeah.
ceremony.
yeah, yeah. So after see, these things go hand in hand. But after the next debogus ceremony, if I survive it, and after the PKD course, which I will survive, um, so yeah, we will definitely have to touch base again. But thank you so much for having me. I just totally delightful. Had a wonderful time.
You
Feeling
too.
is mutual. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll let you go. And
Okay.
You will see you early next year.
All right.
Okay.
That sounds fantastic. Be in touch. I'll go outside now and pick raspberries.
Wonderful.
yeah. Nice.
Enjoy the rest of the day.
Yeah.
You
Have
too.
a wonderful
Thank
rest of your
you.
day. Bye everybody.
Bye.
Bye.